And on the panel, we have Chitra. And we have Eleosa Osunde. And I'm looking for Azina, but I can't find her. She will join us because we want to start this one and make sure we can say as much as we can in this time. On the other side, I'm just going now to start the Future of Poetry panel. So whichever one, enjoy.
Oh, there she is. Nigerians, always running late. How much time do we have?
All the time in the world. I'm giving you 55 minutes.
Wow, awesome. Okay, I guess we should just get right into it then. Hello, everyone. My name is Olutime Adegbeye, and I will be moderating this. I'm already excited for this conversation because I feel like I've had variants of this conversation just in as friendly chats, right? So welcome to me gisting with my friends. I hope you enjoy it. So Chitra and Zina just co-edited She Called Me Woman, which is an anthology of first-hand... All right. First-hand narratives by queer Nigerian women. And Elosa won the Miles Moreland Writing Fellowship for her debut novel, which is about a queer young woman doing, well, things. So I'm going to start this with a piece of information that I got from She Called Me Woman, actually, that the estimated population of queer people in Nigeria is larger than the total population of Lagos State. And there are, allegedly, 22 million people in Lagos. So, Tears. Oh, yes, Azina is also the executive director of the Initiative for Equal Rights. And they conducted a survey in 2014 in which 63% of Nigerians said that they didn't know a queer person, which seems odd if there are more than 22 million queer people. So then the question is it really that there are people who don't know queer people, or they just don't know that they know queer people? Because I think the idea that queer people are a small minority is not necessarily true, but that homophobia makes it such that people's lives, people's experiences are erased. So there's a lot of self-denial as well as denial from external forces. Do you think that this is the case, Zina?
Yes, I think I completely believe that a lot of times there is self-denial because we live in a society where we are socialized to believe that anything that is different is wrong and thus should be othered. Other times it should be criminalized. So people at many times deny what they are, who they feel, or anything that makes them stand out from what is considered as normal, right? So that happens where we deny our own existence. And then many times people project upon you what they want you to be, and no matter how many times you show them that they're different, they insist that you are the same, you should be the same, and you cannot be different. And if you are, you should be punished for being different. So I think it's a mixture of all of it. And so many times we embody that denial of our existence, right? And so that continues to happen in our society.
I really like the point that you make about the embodiment of denial, because I recently published an essay which is basically about me remembering that I'm queer. And the only reason that that sort of thing is possible, that you can forget such an essential part of yourself, is because the denial is everywhere, such that it's impossible for you to affirm your own experiences. So I've heard people say things like, oh, there are so many gay people now. Everybody is gay. Everybody is turning gay. And it's like, people don't turn gay. People realize that something that they've been denying about themselves is, in fact, now, oh wait, this is actually who I am. Or people see other people who are living their truth and then feel more confident to live their truth. But in a world where visibility is considered the only way to be legitimately queer, how do you think that, especially in the context of your book, your subjects navigate that? How do you think queer people navigate the idea that you're not really gay unless you're visible, and then also the idea that it's trendy now to come out as a queer person?
Thank you very much, Jermaine. Thank you very much, Jermaine. I'm not sure it's trendy to come out, but I think a lot more people, to some extent, are doing this now. Not necessarily because it's fashionable, but because perhaps people feel the need to be visible and the need to speak as a counterweight to narratives and public discourse that are happening. I think this is nothing new, and if you read the book, She Called Me Woman, many of our narrators talk about not just themselves, but their family members. So one of our narrators talks about the first time she ever saw two girls kissing was in her grandmother's house, and it was one of her aunts. And she also talks about a great aunt who married a woman. This was in Yoruba land. So this is not new. We had another narrator who was talking about how her mother telling her that in the past that there used to be places in Jos that women could go to find women to have sex with. So this is not new to Nigeria, but I think what happened is a certain level of acceptability that was there in society then became eroded due to many things, including the impact of political discourse, the impact of rising forms of religious fundamentalism, economic impacts as well. And so we started having queerness enter the discourse, the public discourse, in a way that hadn't been public before. And as a result of that, some people felt that they had a duty to be visible, specifically because queer people were being both hyper-visible, so everybody talking about queer people, but invisible, no queer people involved in that discussion, which then meant that the conversation was completely skewed, completely negative, you all know that this thing isn't African, this is not Nigerian, God does not allow it, all of this stuff. So people felt that they had to be visible. But I also think we need to interrogate what we mean by visible. Visible doesn't necessarily mean, taking out a newspaper advert or announcing it on Twitter. It can also mean being visible to your family and friends, and also being visible to the community, to other people like you. And I think what we've seen is actually an increase in the number of people being visible to each other, as well as the people being publicly visible.
And I like the thing you said about visibility not necessarily being a big announcement about a personal situation, because I think one of the ways in which queerness is being made more visible is by queer people writing about what it means to be queer, or just writing about people who also have experiences that are the result of their sexual orientation. So would you share with us a bit about your book and what the book does?
Okay. I think with the narratives that are rising around queerness, right, there is a contrast almost, because people either are talking about homophobic family or they're talking about romantic love. And I think that there is a gap in the middle that people aren't exploring, which is community. And chosen family, I think that both queer as a word and family as a word are both elastic words, and they have so much room inside them for them to be defined and redefined. Because I think when people think about queer, they think about that in contrast to heterosexuality, where it's like, well, you're the other, you're the opposite of straight. And it's like the actual definition of the word queer means that you can make so many relationships that have nothing to do with like heteronormative norms at all. But we're still seeing, conversations, and we're still seeing people say stuff like, or, I'm so surprised that 2 femme women are dating, or I'm so surprised that 2 masculine presenting women are dating. And I'm like, that conversation is so tired. So the novel actually explores non-romantic love between 2 queer people where they don't fall in love at all. But they create a community where there is accountability and there is love and there is grace. Where you're able to grow, you're able to, have someone call you out on your bullshit, and able to love and laugh and have dinners and drink too much and do drugs or whatever. And I think we need to see that because I think even the narratives that are rising are trying to do something important, right? But I also think that it centers homophobic people or it centers straight people where it's just like, oh my God, yeah, like finally see us as human. And then we celebrate that, but I'm tired of that. Who are your friends? If your family rejects you, then whose home are you going to? Who are you sleeping over with? Like, what's happening there? And I think that's what the book does, really. It talks about non-romantic love and how that's transformative and how family is an elastic word. It doesn't always have to do with blood. So,
can we please, y'all, come on now. I really like the fact that you discussed that queerness really just means more rather than otherness. It's just like, there are so many more ways to exist. There's so many more ways to be alive and to interact and to build the world that you inhabit. And it really doesn't have to have anything to do with homophobic people or homophobia. Like, who has time for that? Like, so boring. But then you also mentioned that people, usually homophobic people, reduce what it means to be queer. And so people are like, oh, okay, so that's a gay. And it's just like, which is like, what really? What is that? It's just like, but there are so many different ways to be queer. Shout out to Mona. And queerness isn't just about sexuality or even about who you sleep with. Just if you inhabit the world in a way that's not normative, then you can claim some kinds of queerness. But specifically, I want to talk to you, Zina, about queerness that is about gender expression and gender identity. Because I feel like even within the queer community, people are like, oh yeah, you're gay and you're lesbian and you're bi, so you're kind of a hoe. But what is a trans person? Or what is a non-binary? So you're not even part.
You haven't even heard people ask what an intersex person is.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So
my favorite one is when they're like, which one? So we have LGBT. Which one is QIAA2S? I'm not learning those ones. And it's like, how can we, even within our own community, delegitimize people just because their queerness is a different kind than ours, right?
So for me, right, I love the fact that these questions even come up, that people are curious as to what the QIA and so many other acronyms and whatever it is that comes up are. It means that people are willing and open to learn more. They're willing to take in more and to explore what that could mean. So for me, that's important and it's interesting, which means that I end up having very intrusive conversations with people whom I have never met, sometimes in the gym bathroom while I am changing. But again, we thank God the conversation is being had. And so when it comes to, I think, gender norms and expressions and how people see us, that's not normal, and that's not just because of queerness, right? That's why, say, in a heterosexual relationship, if a woman is more vocal about her person, when she has more autonomy of herself and her husband lets her. In Hausaland, for example, they call that Mijin Hajia, that he's the wife of Hajia. So he's no longer the husband. We have been socialized in such a way that people should stay in their place, in their role, where there's masculinity and femininity. That's why even when 2 people are in a relationship and they are queer, people ask who's the man and who's the woman. And who's the fucker and who's the fucky? Sorry, I'm not sure if this goes, but questions like that come up all the time. And yes, I said, again, intrusive questions all the time.
Hide your kids.
And people expect that there has to be that binary, that opposite for a relationship to exist between people. And we insist that that should be it. And if somebody goes outside those norms, that's where we start to resist it. And we see that, for example, in fact, in gender nonconformity. especially, for example, in Hausaland, where there are men who have traditionally been allowed to express themselves as not exactly masculine. I'm talking about Ndaudu in like northern Nigeria, right? But because masculinity is so honored, one is allowed to perform femininity as long as in the end, they will come back and project as masculine. So it's all these masculine roles that society already has for everybody, and we have also taken it in as a queer community, where you hear people saying, that girl not my bro, I can't date her, because that person is also masculine. Or sometimes they're like, they're both two femmes, they can't date, as she said. And you hear that being circulated again and again, and it all just comes down to how we expect people to be, how we expect people to project, react, and just be in society. There has to be a difference. And I think that's where the problem lies. Unless we dismantle that expectation that there's a male and a female, and that's how it should be, that's the only way it should be. And which then brings me again back to people who transcend that. They're either non-binary or they are trans in the way that they feel that they want to express themselves in the gender other than they were pronounced at birth, and then the intersex people who are just right there in the middle. For those who don't know what intersex is, those were the people we traditionally called in the past hermaphrodites, but that's politically incorrect. These are people who are, a man has the XY chromosome and a woman has the XX. So there are some people who have XXY or YXX and a bunch of other combinations. And sometimes they have both masculine and feminine attributes or things that we don't normally see. And these are completely normal. At least 10% of every society is intersex. But we don't discuss that because people see it as shame. When families have kids that are intersex, the things that we do is that we take them through unnecessarily medical interventions. Many people don't even grow up knowing that they are intersex until they go to a hospital at some point having some problems. So again, it brings me down to when people talk about gender-based violence, especially genital mutilation. I say some of the people who suffer the most genital mutilation are intersex people, and they don't get to have a say because they're kids. So when we're having conversations as a whole, as a society, we need to broaden it to include everybody. If we want equality, it has to be for everyone.
Thank you so much. And then to come to you, the first narrative, wait, you're going to do an excerpt from the book. Just say when.
I can do it right now,
okay.
Because one of the excerpts that I had is specifically about gender roles within same-sex relationships.
Oh, great. Okay, great. So we'll just take the excerpt.
One of the issues that is really under-examined in public discourse around sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, and also to some extent within LGBTQIA communities themselves, is around gender roles, abuse, and violence within same-sex relationships. And when we were putting the book together, we really wanted to reflect a diversity of experiences, and we were very careful to try and reflect people's realities as much as possible. So we didn't want to put together a book of 25 narrators who were all perfect queer women living in Nigeria. And so this is one of the narrators that I interviewed, which I personally found very difficult and challenging. And when I read, I'll get to it. When I read it, maybe you can understand why. So this is from a narrative called Some Things You Do for Your Heart. If anybody beyond Azina has a copy of the book, it's on page 297 that I'm going to read from. I count myself as the man in the relationship. I'm the pole, the head of the family, definitely. As the father of the family, I'm the one to dictate what happens in the relationship. No matter how busy you are, you have to tell me in advance that you're going out. In any relationship, there has to be a man and a woman, even if it's between two women. In Nigeria, they believe that once you call yourself a man, you have to handle everything in the relationship. Even if your woman has responsibilities, she will expect you to say something before she does it. I'm the one who carries the large part of the relationship. She's included in some things, but out of 100%, I carry 99%, with only 1% left for my babe. And then he goes on to, sorry, not he. I think
Exactly, right?
yeah, and then she goes on, to talk about the pressure around being the breadwinner of the family, and says, in this Nigeria, if you're working somewhere, they may owe you 4, 5, 6 months' salary without paying. When she's not working, I can't expect her to steal. Once I'm working, I have to take good care of her. It's this way because in Nigeria, if you don't work and take good care of your baby, they'll look for another person outside. So I read this because for me, when I was interviewing her, I was just looking at her and thinking, I feel like this is the same conversation that I've had with so many men around pressures when it comes to this particular type of breadwinner masculinity that we have, that the man is only valuable if he's providing for the family, but also these ideas around coercion and control, the idea that your girlfriend has to ask you for permission before you leave the house. I feel that if even a lot of men don't necessarily go quite that far. And I think that this is something that's really important to highlight because we need to accept and understand and work on the ways that women have also internalized patriarchy. And I think that there's this idea of the masculine, whereas it may be, I mean, of course, Nigerian society does not necessarily value and actually denigrates masculine presenting women within a relationship. The idea of performing masculine roles, you're seen to have more power, more control, and more status. And I think the way that that plays out when it comes to violence against women within relationships is really important, especially also because a lot of times people don't necessarily see, because the gender roles are so stark, the way that they're presented, when it's the woman in the relationship who's more on the masculine side of the spectrum, it's also expected that there's no way that she can be experiencing intimate partner violence and abuse. And I think this is a really important thing to talk about, not just in the community, but also amongst feminists in Nigeria. In the feminist movement, in the anti-violence against women and girls movement, there is hardly anything around violence in same-sex relationships.
Just to build on that point, I think the fact that queerness and queer relationships are erased in the popular consciousness creates a volatile situation because the secrecy allows all kinds of abuse to fester, right? You said something about shame, and I have a comment here about how shame and stigma create vulnerability because there's this idea that gay people, and it's always gay people in the public imagination, right, want to recruit other people into the movement for gayness, or even worse, that queerness, or more specifically homosexuality, is somehow comparable to pedophilia. Whereas, first of all, evidence indicates that 96% of sexual abusers are straight identifying men. Surprise. But also, if anything, this kind of erasure and homophobia makes queer people, especially young queer people, particularly vulnerable to abuse, specifically because they're queer. When I was 12 years old, I had a pastor sexually violate me because I had gone to say, oh, I don't know why I like girls. And he's like, oh, which girls are you looking at? What are you looking at on their body? I'm just like, and how would you like them to touch you? And so very rarely is it the case that it's like queer people who are going out and abusing people. Rather, it's that queer people are being abused and we can't talk about it. But then yesterday we were talking about how sometimes the fact that we are so vulnerable to abuse from outsiders and there's so much shame then makes it difficult for us to interact with one another ethically, right? So then we're enacting the same violence on one another that outsiders enact on us. Could you share with them the tea from last night?
So we're having a conversation about that, and I was saying how violence in queer communities is so rampant, and it's rarely discussed because also there is that thing where if you are the marginalized group, there is something about it. There is a support. You know, like this is the community. You know, we're not supposed to say these things out loud, and it's not supposed to come outside of the circle. Because if it comes outside of the circle, then we're going to be further marginalized, which we cannot afford.
Think?
What?
What will the straights think?
Do you know what I mean? So it's like, if they find out about this, then what are they going to think about us? They're going to think that, you know, we're wrong, like we're even wronger than we are. And I think that there is that shame, and I think even when we talk about, like, you know, community, I think there needs to be that. There needs to be safety in communities for people to say, listen, this is not okay. Like, this is what I'm going through in this relationship. And community should not keep that inside. There should be ways to deal with that. There should be ways to deal with that and hold people accountable who are being abusive. Without it just being like, oh yeah, you know, she's the masculine one now. That's what, you know, she's just aggressive. That's just how it is. It's like, no. And I think there is more tolerance within those relationships because it's like, it's not two women, you people, you know. And I don't think that's okay. So yeah.
We should absolutely have the same standards for how we treat one another, regardless of what the dynamics of the relationship are. But if we're going to say, for instance, that queerness means more, then it should also mean more safety, because the world is already so incredibly violent that we need to be more deliberate about how we care for one another. To go back to you, Chitra, I was going to ask you, the first narrative in the book is by a trans woman, and she's the only self-identifying trans person in the book. And I feel like, again, queerness, then people are like, oh, but what is transness? So how did you find her, first of all? Was she part of your communities originally? And then also, because I feel like so many of the conversations about queerness are whether or not we specify it, are about cis people. Do you know of the ways in which, for instance, trans community is being built and activism that's being done around trans or gender non-conforming issues?
Can I steal that question, please?
You can both take it.
So what I was actually going to say is I can start answering that question and then I will ask Azina to finish. I don't just steal people's questions.
Thank you.
So what I want to start off by saying is that she's the only out trans person in the book. But actually, if you read the narratives carefully, you'll see that there's a whole range of gender identities being expressed there. And not everybody necessarily has the language. And also because this language is not ours, right? Like the idea of trans is developed in a very particular context in Europe and North America. In Nigeria, there were different ideas and different fluidities of gender identity. Zina has just mentioned one earlier about the Yandaudu. So in the book, actually, in addition to the first narrative, She Called Me Woman, which is the titular narrative, you also have narrators who talk about how, if they had the choice, they would identify as men, but they can't because of the society in which they live. And so a society, it's really interesting for that narrator where you're able to just about be open about your sexual orientation, but then this is just one step too far and it would completely break your parents' hearts. Also, narratives where people talk about what could be termed as non-binariness. And also a narrative where the narrator there talks about identifying very strongly as a boy when in her childhood. And it's, for me, because I was the one who interviewed that narrator, it was impossible to figure out whether this narrator was fighting against the patriarchal society and wanting to do things that were seen as things that only boys could do, like run, and not get married at a young age and have access to education, or whether this was actually a case of gender fluidity. And I think in the context of Nigeria, that's also really interesting, because what does What does gender identity and fluidity around gender identity mean in a society where there is such rigidity in the mainstream around gender roles and norms? And now Azina can answer.
I want to follow up on that first before we move. I find it very interesting that there are so many places where we see strong women who are assertive, and then we start to call them men. We even give them male privileges, like titles, and allow them to marry wives. And so it is very interesting that we are so rigid that once you stepped through, it means then you have to be the other gender because that's the only other explanation, which is weird because historically, especially with the Yoruba gods, they've always, like a ton of them are gender fluid. And now to discuss gender fluidity with Yoruba people is weird. I'm like, y'all should be teaching us, not the other way around.
We forgot.
But anyways, in case you haven't read this book, I know I am biased and I was part of writing this, so I think it's amazing. But just even for the story of this individual, you have to buy the book. So I came across this person.
I'm going to give away 3 copies.
Awesome,
So,
thank you.
Catch me outside.
So yeah, this individual had worked across from my office for 3 years, and I had no idea that she was a trans woman. And one day we were discussing gender, because I wasn't out also at that time. I was living in my tiny little closet, and somebody mentioned if I had ever spoken to Ella about transitioning. And I was like, no. They were like, oh, that's a trans woman. And I was like, no, that's not true. So I walk up to her, and we have a conversation about transness. And this person expresses femininity in ways that I can never hope to. That is the most feminine woman I've probably ever met in my life. She is so beautiful. She's gorgeous. And one of the reasons why her stories are so captivating, especially to me, is because it comes so naturally to her. She was born male. She went to OAU, right? And UI, yes. And the title of the book actually came from her story because she said even when she wasn't ready to call herself a woman, her professor called her a woman. And she told her to express herself in the way that she wanted to, encouraged her to wear makeup and wear earrings and just allow herself to be. And many times when we hear stories of queerness, of transness, of non-binary, it's always a story of abuse and of hatred. But this story has so much joy, so much acceptance, so much just, it's natural. And a lot of people could see that obviously this person did not fit into the body that she was at that time. And once she started to present as who she really was, she got all the acceptance in the world to the extent that you can't tell that she's a trans woman. And she's so amazing. She's always generous with her story. If you read up on the book online, you see a lot of interviews she's already given since the book has been released. And she's just such an amazing, graceful, gorgeous woman who's just always, always ready to teach people and always ready to learn. And she has such a great story. And anyways, everybody ought to read it. It'll do. Let them read it themselves. I don't want to take all the time just talking about all the amazing people who shared their stories with us. But yeah, I love, love, love the fact that otherness is being discussed and normalized and just being
Interesting coincidence. I actually went to school with Ella. Oh, that's a pretty boy. And then over the course of she was a couple of years ahead of me. So over the course of the next 3 years, I went from like, that's a pretty boy to, oh, of course that's not a boy. That makes sense. Because the first time I saw her, I ran up to her, I was like, oh my God, I love your jeans. Where did you get them? Because they were so cute. And she had this really stylish thing. We used to walk down the same street in UI to get, her faculty was just maybe 3 or 4 minutes before mine. So I used to run into her quite a bit. And I remember when she came back to sort out her NYSC. And by then, I think she had transitioned socially fully. And it just made perfect sense. So I feel like the idea that people have that transness is wrongness is...
like you're doubting God, like God did wrong. That's what people
like,
say. And I'm like, not the thousands of gods we have in the world.
And people are, in the end, people are in charge of their own destinies. Oh, that got a rise out of y'all. We've been talking about gays all day. Y'all ain't got nothing to say. Somebody said God one time. People.
One time, there were thousands of gods.
thousands of gods. Oh.
Let's talk about this idea of these two Abrahamic religions that were gifted to us.
We only have 20 minutes left, Zena. We ain't got time.
But our God, Allah and Christ, and yeah, those are the only two we recognize. Anything else, and you're a pagan.
So what are you? So are you a Christian? No. So you're a Muslim? No. So you are a what? A gay?
But I think we can't have this conversation without talking about religion.
Absolutely.
And I think for me, what was really interesting when we were doing this project was the different approaches our narrators had towards religion. So some people had stepped away completely from faith, which is also a perspective that we don't hear often in Nigeria. Some people, partly because of the homophobia and the queerphobia that they were hearing, but a lot of people tried to find ways to reconcile their queerness and their faith. And for me, one of the stories that was really telling was about one of the narrators who was going through a real kind of personal crisis to the extent of being heavily depressed and actually trying to slit her wrists at one point. And she said that what made the difference was actually her uncle, who was a pastor. And her uncle took her to church and pointed at the figure of Jesus on the cross and said, "Do you believe in this?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "That's all that matters. Everything else is between you and God." Yes, but the same bishop, uncle person is also denouncing homosexuality from the pulpit on Sundays during his service. So I think this really shows to me that what we see as how Nigerians are about this topic can be very different from what people actually think. And I think that this is also a real erasure that we're seeing. Like all the voices, most of the voices in the public sphere, in the media discourse, are all very virulently homophobic, transphobic, negative. But actually, in people's lives, even these people who are expressing these things may think very differently. And one of the things that we found while doing the project was actually that there were so many spaces of joy and resistance and love and friendship. And so this idea that the lives of queer people in Nigeria are all 100% bad, that's not true. I mean, I'm not saying that it's wonderful, but there are all of these spaces for connecting and existing and finding support. You know, mothers who counsel you through breakups, cousins who try and set you up with women, pastors who counsel you through your own personal struggles with your sexuality. And I think it's really important to highlight that as well.
I had something to say about that.
Go.
I think that it's embedded in like our cultural identity to have plural faces. So to have a public face and to have a private face, right? So some parents actually don't have a problem with you being queer. They have a problem with you presenting as queer. So I really think that that's also an important distinction to make, because it's not necessarily a personal problem. It's a problem about the public, and they're not willing to get that backlash because of your personal decision. So that's the thing, where they're just like, see, I love you, but I not reach like that. It's not that far. It has not gone that far. So like, do whatever you're doing, but do it in the house, or do it in your person's house. And then when you're out in public, whether that is marriage, or whether that is the way you dress, I don't care. So far, it doesn't come back to me. And I think that matters, the fact that we actually have plural faces. And that is, it cuts across all things, right? Whether it's any kind of identity, really. Is it going to come back to me in a bad way? Are people going to come and ask me, is this your picking? If that's a thing, then I don't actually want that. And I think it's the fear of backlash more than it is homophobia, if that makes sense. But of course, that comes back, you know. So.
And just to riff off the point that you've just made, so I wanted to talk about the fragmentation. that can happen and the impacts on that on people's mental health when you're forced to have multiple lives, because in this context you can be this and in that context you can be that, and you have to compartmentalize. And so there are high rates of people using drugs, using sex, using escapism really to deal with this type of pressure. In the line of your work at Tears, what would you say about like the ways in which queer people cope with this type of fragmentation? What have you seen?
Well, since you've put it on the table, thank you. So I'm going to use this opportunity to self-promote the organization I work for, which is the Initiative for Equal Rights. And it's a human rights organization that works specifically for the rights of minorities in Nigeria. We have offices on the mainland, on the island. We work nationally, and we try to support queer people in different ways, with legal help, with clinical help, mental health. We do a lot of media work to change this idea that homosexuality is un-African, so we do a lot of movies, documentaries, and just create alternative narratives. And so one of the things that we experience all the time is people reaching out to help, somebody to just talk to. On any given day, the person who handles our social media has to provide support to people to talk to who's just like, I'm gay, I don't know who I can talk to. So our DMs are just full of people who are reaching out to help. The people who call the helpline are looking for somebody to talk to, or places where they can just go and see acceptance in somebody's eyes. And so many people are depressed, are dealing with so many things about having to present as straight, or a couple of people also call because the people that they're married to are queer. That is more common than I expected when I started working at Tears. Like recently, a woman called and said that she just found out that her husband is bisexual, and she saw one of our series and she didn't know what to do about it. So how can we help her? I was like, well, you need to talk to him first. It's not something we can help you with, but that's how people are constantly trying to reach. They're just trying to echo and see that they're normal, that there are other people like them, that there are people that they can talk to, and somebody will just hold their hand, which is why we always have community centers where people can just drop in, where you can access books that you wouldn't get in other places, where you can get movies, books, documentaries, and just be in a space where you can see other queer people and see that it's okay. But the conversation about mental health in Nigeria so far has been very divorced from the roles that we make people play. Okay, so many people, and this is also rising in the queer community, so many people have this pressure of having to marry people of the opposite sex just to pass and get the pressure off them. And I see so many gay men who are just like, please set me up with a lesbian so I can just let my parents be off my case. And we need to stop that. It drives people to places that we shouldn't have to drive them to. It still comes back to otherness is okay. You don't have to do things for society, and society needs to step back for a bit. I don't even know who the society is, but take a chill pill, society.
All of y'all.
Yeah.
Everybody.
And so, like, our community, again, has to deal with so much. Already being Nigerian is stressful enough.
Yes, say that.
And then to now deal with the pressure of your family, and then deal with the fact that you are considered others, and other from others, is a lot to deal with. And I'm not surprised that people have to turn to drugs, to alcohol, to very many things that we know is unacceptable just because you're different.
Does anybody know how much time we have left? Okay. Okay, so then... Question, because I don't know. Do we have questions? Okay, great. So...
If you can project, just do it.
Okay. Hello,
Time
everybody.
up? Oh, time up.
Okay, so the name is
Okay.
John. So the question goes as, is there or are there any opportunities out there? Like I've heard of Tears and what they do with healthcare and other stuff, but are there any other opportunities like scholarships or anything for queer people to help them advance in life? Because most of the times when you see queer people, you see them doing menial jobs and then giving up their career because they cannot advance into, you cannot project into that space where they don't see it, they don't see themselves in it. So are there opportunities like that to help people to just make them come out and be great, like scholarship opportunities and all that?
So I'm going to answer that really quickly. A couple of organizations do. I know Women's Health and Equal Rights in Abuja does. I know that ICAR does. We try to provide opportunities for internship at tiers so that you can at least have some formal training you can put on your CV, and we will recommend you. But most of the opportunities are really within the community. We're very, there's a ton of people in the creative industry, because then you can present as who you want to be, right? And you just need to find somebody who would mentor you within that space, but we don't have anything formal yet.
Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you, ladies. Hazina. I think that for me, the distance between forget or ignore or pretend doesn't exist, because we need to open that space and that discourse to ensure that at the same time we're having an academic discussion, we're also creating an avenue to create further space outside of academia. I know all of you. Do you understand? But that's from a professional perspective. But I'm sure that there's a lot more we can do to ensure that that disconnect between feminism and our sisters in the queer community is slowly closing. Because right now the gap is the Nigerian feminists are standing here. Those of us like myself that understand the discourse are few and far between, and the others are over here. And so we need to narrow that discussion down so that we don't have the disconnect that we currently have.
There's a question at the back. Do you want to? Yeah, okay.
Hi. Hi, my name is Fauzia. The question that I had was pertaining to the book, actually. So I've read it several times, blessed be. And I find it really amazing. But what I noticed about it was that it seems like a lot of the stories, apart from the titular story, it seems like they follow the same sort of pattern. And is it that, my question was, like, is it that the queer narrative in Nigeria is the same that makes the experiences sort of similar? Because you could just, in a way, you could switch the names a little bit and then switch a few plot points a little bit, but it always comes out to pretty much the same.
I think we wanted to do everything. We wanted to cover people's childhood. We wanted to cover their professional lives. We wanted to cover their struggles, their fate, everything. So we ended up asking all those questions, and we thought that the answers were interesting enough to stay in the book. So maybe that came off in the way that everybody's answers could fit into the narratives, but that was also us just trying to ensure that we put everything in there.
And maybe you're talking about an issue of structure rather than content, because I actually think that the stories are really different.
So I'm just preempting on the issue of feminist and queer women. It's not queer women who should bridge the gap. It should be feminists. So I'm sick and tired I'm a feminist, but I'm sick and tired of most African feminists. So I just want to save you from responding. We should take that step. It's not queer women who'd make that step. It's not for you to. Because if you're a feminist, what's your feminism if you are discriminating against a bunch of women because you don't like their sexuality?
Yes, also queer women are feminists, so we out here. There's one more question, and we're going to take an excerpt, a last quick excerpt.
Good afternoon.
I love you too.
I feel we are talking about discrimination here. And most narratives are always centered on women. Nigerians are more receptive of queer women than queer men. And there's a problem there, because now everybody on the panel are women. Most narratives we listen to are from the point of view of the women. We need to start listening to the men too. Because I feel if we are also doing some discrimination if we don't let the men say their own stories.
Okay, no, I'm starting. Hello? Veto power. So I need to say, first of all, that I don't disagree that people are more receptive to the idea of queer women, But in the Nigerian imagination, a gay is not a woman. That's the first thing. In the second instance, people don't take queer women's sexuality seriously. So it's like, oh, you know, you just never see the person we go. And even within the community, it's a conversation that we have. Sorry, right. Oh, we need to go. It's a conversation that we have that the problems, the issues that are discussed have an overrepresentation of the masculine perspective. So I promise you that's not a real problem. I guarantee.
And men dominate every conversation we have in Nigeria. The conversation about homosexuality or otherness has been always about men and HIV. This is the first time that women are being centered to talk about their own experiences.
Yeah, and
there is another book that is coming out that is about the experiences of men. I hope you look forward to it. But yes.
Plus, also, we have to remember that queer women are women living in a very highly patriarchal society. So actually, a lot of what the narrators that we spoke to was, yes, issues that they experienced was, yes, because of their queerness, but it was because they were queer women living in Nigeria. So I think that we need to take that into account because, as Azina said, both the media narratives, and also, frankly, the LGBT community itself has been really dominated by men who have sex with men. And this is really one of the first times that we're actually talking about queer women, queer women's lives, and queer women's realities. Okay, I'll be very quick, Lala, I promise. So I wanted us to finish with this because I feel that we've had a very important but yet quite serious discussion. And I wanted to end with something that was a bit lighter to show the fun and the joy in people's lives too. And so this is from a narrative that's called I Don't Believe in Love. And this is our narrator talking about the first time she ever had sex with another woman. She was the first adult girl I was with, and the sex was very good. Before that, I had sex with a number of guys, but not like this. This, hands down, was the best sex I had ever had in my life. The other guys, it was not like they were bad. I mean, I liked a few of them, but she was the best. After that night, and during the next weeks, my friends got tired of me because I kept calling them like, oh my God, I just had the best sex of my life. And they were like, what the fuck? You just told me the story yesterday. And I'd be like, yeah, I need to tell you again. I do not know what she did, but it was that good. Thank you.
Please, let's give these 4 incredible women a proper Ake Festival applause. Wait for your group photo. Look at that. Isn't it amazing that we can have this kind of conversation in Nigeria? I'm very, very proud. Thank you. No. Thank you for your openness and for sharing your lives and your stories with us. Thank you very much. So, I like this between feminism and queerness that Iheoma talked about. I think it's something to explore next year. We have to talk about it. Yeah, I'm definitely thinking it. The next event is a book chat in here with Bisi Ajakmo and Sefiata. It's in here.